Join your host, Maddie Roach, as she brings you into a community of fee-only financial advisors who are successfully building profitable businesses that serve the next generation of clients. Learn from innovative advisors whose unique stories will inspire you to dream big and take action on your goals. Are you ready to live your best life and help your clients live theirs? Then you're in the right place.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I'm Maddie Roach, your host. Today, XYPN co-founders Alan Moore and Michael Kitces join us for a special episode to discuss all the findings of the 2020 XYPN benchmarking survey. Each year, XYPN members participate in a comprehensive survey about their businesses. And each year, Michael and Alan riff on the trends they see, the themes that have emerged, and of course, offer their perspective on where this industry is headed. If you're interested in hearing about what XYPN member firms are experiencing this year, then this show is for you. Avocado toast, selfies, a mountain of student loan debt. Gen Y is anything but traditional, and with over 75 million people, it's a population you don't want to ignore. Learn more about how to serve this unique population in our guide called Attract and Profitably Serve Millennial Clients in Your RIA. Discover 3 key ways to tap into the millennial market and 6 things that they want from their financial advisor. Visit xyplanningnetwork.com/millennials for your free copy. You can find any of the resources we mentioned during the episode at xyplanningnetwork.com/288. Also, be sure to go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to join our private group just for XYPN radio listeners. It's a community of advisors we've all been looking for that's there to provide support when we need it the most. Best of all, it's free. I encourage you to check it out. Again, that's xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Without further ado, here is this week's conversation with Alan and Michael.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I am your guest co-host, Alan Moore, with my guest co-host, Michael Kitces. Michael, welcome to the show.
Man, I'm a guest. I don't even feel like I'm a guest co-host. I'm like a guest co-host of the guest co-host. I'm a second derivative guest co-host. Like this podcast has come a long way over the past couple of years. I'm still adjusting to the new reality. Maddie's just been crushing it for a while now, so it's exciting to be back as a guest co-host.
Yeah, from the time of this recording, because we're recording the week of Thanksgiving. A year ago, I was on my way to my sabbatical, and Maddie took over the podcast and has been hosting ever since, and has been doing a great job with it. And thankful that she's picked up the reins. Today, I'm back and Michael's back to talk about our annual benchmarking study. This is a study that we do every year of our members here at XY Planning Network and aggregate that data and put it into a study to be able to show, the realizations, the real life of starting, running, and growing a financial planning firm as a member of XY Planning Network. So today we're going to go through, we've got 6 or 7 different sort of primary graphs that we're going to be talking about. And you'll be able to find that information on our website at xyplanningnetwork.com/286 for episode 286. So xyplanningnetwork.com/286. To be able to find the graphs if you want to be able to follow along, because we're going to be sort of talking about data, and painting pictures with our hands, which of course you cannot see, but that will sort of help as we go into it. So we'll sort of kick off. This is our 4th year doing a benchmarking survey, correct?
It is. This is something we started, pretty early on in the network. As I view it, XYPN is kind of kicking off this new business model and approach and focus of doing fee-for-service financial planning, particularly around monthly subscription fees. Although we, as we see in the benchmarking study, like a growing and wide range of different ways that advisors are charging fees and generating revenue. And I've long had an admiration for a guy named Mark Tibergien, who I know Mark Allen, and a few people who are listening to as well. Marcus was kind of the practice management guru of the RIA business in particular, going back for almost 30 years now. And the reason is because he literally made the first benchmarking study of RIAs back when like a really big firm had $17 million under management and an assistant, because in the 1990s, that was a big firm. And he started these benchmarking studies all the way back in the 1990s and has now basically documented 25 odd years of how the growth and evolution of the RA model has occurred. And so, like I really viewed it the same thing that I think as something new gets created in the industry at XYPN, I was really interested in having us kind of capture that, basically document it. I view our benchmarking studies almost like a documentary of how this business model is evolving over time. And so, yeah, like we are, I guess, coming up on 6 years in the network, 4 years that we've been running the benchmarking study, which means kind of 5 years worth of trailing data. So almost from the beginning of like, how does this actually work over time? Like when you do this and you get going, like what does it actually grow and add up to over time?
Yeah, admittedly, early on in XY Planning Network, I'm the vision sales guy, and so I was selling this vision of entrepreneurship and that how great it would be to start a business, and I got a lot of pushback and really critical feedback that was helpful. That said, hey, like I think you're overselling entrepreneurship, you're overselling the journey. It's harder than you're making it out to be, and so one of the things I found so helpful about this this benchmarking study is the results showing ultimately the path. And people, some are faster, some are slower, but in the end, we're going to talk about sort of the average journey of someone who's starting a firm with XY Planning Network and getting going. And so our sort of first chart that we're going to talk through is revenue over time. And what this allows us to say is how much someone earns in year 1, year 2, 3, and 4. As they grow their firm. And shockingly, what we see is that you make more money every year, right? So your income does go up, but the first couple years are really, really hard. And now we have sort of 4 years, we have 4 cohorts, and sort of what year 1 look like, each time. And year 1 for everyone, ever since we started this study, is really hard.
Yeah. Is really hard. We have like 4 good years worth of first year data. Like, what was it like for a first year member in 2016? What was it like for a first year member in 2017? What was it like for a first year member in 2018? What was it like for a first year member in 2019? Obviously, we don't have the 2020 data yet. We'll tell you in a couple of months when we run the study looking back at this year. And, first as a note here, like we are very specific when we do this benchmarking study, some of these numbers in particular, to only look at members who are actually starting from scratch with us. Because we do have firms that join us and are like, I'm making $100,000 my first year. It's like, cool. What did you have when you started? $100,000 that I brought with me from my prior firm. It's like, okay, awesome for you, but like not really representative of the average person's experience who doesn't get to bring a whole bunch of clients with them. So this is specifically members who start essentially from scratch with either no clients or like maybe you broke away and your mom and your aunt came with you, but like almost no clients came with you. And so those firms that start from scratch, what we've seen from 4 years of first year data is, as I sometimes put it, like the first year sucks for everyone. Average revenue every single year, somewhere between $10,000 and $13,000 gross, right? Not net after expenses. You don't take out 10 to 13. Like you gross 10 to 13. If you're doing this super lean, maybe you broke even, is what the first year looks like. Like it's awful for everyone. And it's actually stunning to me, having repeated this for 4 years, how little difference there is.
It really has been consistently
in that
difficult.
outcome. Yeah.
Yeah, and the realities make sense, right? Even if you start your business on January 1st, you start sending out emails and calling folks, you go to networking events, you host some webinars, clients, you get some prospect meetings in February or March, they think about it, maybe they sign up in June, they start the planning process. Maybe you start getting your monthly fee or an upfront fee in August, September, October, right? And so, it just takes a while for even those people who you already know, much less those who you don't yet know, to sort of come in, build trust, build that relationship, and ultimately kick off a financial planning relationship. But then going into year 2, you now have an established group of clients on January 1st who are going to pay you a full year's fee, whereas no one paid you a full year fee in year 1. Which is why, we sort of see this somewhere, year 1 range is 10 to 13,000 a year. And in year two, we're actually seeing this go up over time. In 2017, it was 38,000, then it went to 45,000, and then it went to 54,000 for year two income. And so last year we showed, it showed that in year two, people were making on average $54,000 in their second year of business.
And again, we should clarify, like grossing $54,000. We don't have expenses in this yet. We'll talk a little bit later about kind of expenses and net profitability, but just we are talking gross revenue numbers. But generally, by the time you're getting anywhere from $38,000 to $54,000 of revenue out, like this is cash flow positive. You are probably not making your own salary, and you are probably not supporting yourself on this. Like this is cash flow positive and is feeling better. And what we certainly see just in practice for most firms that start from scratch, like the first year feels awful for everyone. The second year still doesn't feel great because you're not making the dollars that you probably hope or wish or were making before you made this switch into this thing. But it's cash flow positive and the numbers are going up.
Yeah, I mean, this second year, really early second year, mid second years, we like to call the oh crap, what did I do phase, right? This is when it's like, I'm working a lot, I'm working hard, but I'm not making a lot of money, but you're starting to see that income go up. And really year three, I would say, is when you start to hit income replacement. So in 2018, we showed that in year three, you're making $83,000 on average. In 2019, it did drop just a little bit to $79,000, which is $3,000 difference or $4,000 difference, not a big shift. But what that shows is that really year three is when we start to see advisors taking a paycheck from the company that is getting really close to their leaving their prior employment income, right? And sort of growing, because then leading into year four, we see a huge jump going into year four, or 4 plus, I should say, which is, it jumps from 79,000 to 181,000. And so we really see that it does take 3 to 4 years to really gain traction. Some are able to do a little faster, some are able to do a little slower, but really that three-year mark is really when you're going to hit your stride.
And again, these numbers have been amazingly consistent. When we ran this study last year, members that were in their fourth year were doing, I think it was $179,000. And this year, the average was $181,000. Like it has actually amazed me how consistent these numbers are of just, at the end of the day, we can only grow so fast. We can only get so many clients. We can only prospect so quickly. We can only onboard them so quickly. We can only figure out all the stuff there is to figure out, and just learning the business and going through our personal growth journey. And so we continue to run these numbers year after year after year, and they are just stunningly consistent. I think as we've gotten a little bit better at helping members kind of find niches and focus into niches and get their growth engines going a little more quickly, we are seeing second year revenue growth get a little bit better as the years go by. And I'm kind of curious to see if that translates into better third year growth and just carries momentum as we get more years of the study and the research in place. But the essence of it, I mean, if you just want to think of kind of the progression of a firm, because again, these numbers have been really, really consistent from year to year with almost no change. I mean, literally talking like just 1,000 or 2 of change throughout. What you're essentially talking about is year one, you make 10 grand of revenue. Year two, you make 40. Year three, you make 80. And year four, you make 180. And so that progression, like 10, 40, 80, 180 is essentially what we're seeing, plus or minus just a remarkably few thousands of dollars.
Well, and to be fair, this year it was 55, not 40. It was 10, 55, 80, 180.
Yeah. So we are
seeing even higher.
We are seeing a little bit of a lift up in year two. And, on the one hand, I feel like there's just some natural frustration that comes from this, that again, we see this year after year in the study that for the average member, the growth in year four is more than all of the first 3 years combined, right? Just that kind of sequence, like 10, 50, 80, 180. Like it took me 3 years to get to 80. And then the fourth year I had 100 on top of the 80. And on the one hand, I feel like some people give sort of a WTF moment of like, what's so great by then? And I think a lot of people naturally ask like, well, cool. How do I make year four happen in like year 3 or 2? Because I'd really like to get to that number a little bit quicker. And And I think we're trying to figure that out in what we can do and help to build and train and facilitate at XYPN itself. But at the end of the day, like, we live in a business of building trust and relationships, and the reality is, like, you can just only speed up relationships and business building so fast, right? The famous saying in the business is, people do business with people they know, like, and trust, and you can just only get known, liked, and trusted so quickly. And I feel like that's part of what we're seeing in this. Maybe we can pull these growth curves forward a little bit in trying to figure out like better systems that accelerate the process of building and growth. But frankly, I don't think we're ever going to see some world where you can just launch and be at 180 of revenue by year two. Just, it takes time. It takes time to be known, liked, and trusted. It takes time to establish yourself. The truth is, for so many of us that launch, it takes time just to get comfortable in our own skin, to kind of get over the imposter syndrome that we feel sometimes, to be able to say to a client with a straight face, like, I charge $5,000 a year, and you're going to be super happy to pay me that $5,000. Right? For the average member that starts, like, we sort of say, like, my fee's $1,500. Like, we'll even say it as a question, because like so not comfortable, not confident yet. It's really hard to say it. It's a little freaky, like you're putting a price on your value. What if they say no because I don't have any other prospects right now? So we start discounting our stuff and pressuring ourselves and all the stuff that layers on. And it just takes us time, I think, as human beings sometimes to work through that and power through that. And so, numbers may shift a little bit as we try to help members accelerate this curve, but just realistic expectations for people. I mean, if you start looking at this of a growth curve of like 10, 40, 80, 180, or maybe 10, 50, 80, 180, of what revenue looks like over the first 4 years, like that's the benchmark. And that's part of why we urge so hard, like, make sure you've got a foundation in place to be able to get through the tough years when you launch. Like, you don't get the 180 in year 4 if you didn't have enough savings to get through year 2.
Yeah, I mean, and we're going to talk about a couple of these in some of these points, but we've talked about this in previous years as well, where we see, folks, pretty much everyone in the network raise their fees over time. And so, coming into this, there are a couple of things you can do. And people say, what should I be working on if I'm planning to launch a firm one day? One is get your CFP. CFP designation matters. Define a niche. Okay. Define who you want to work with and start building relationships in that community. It helps when you ultimately get started. Price your services appropriately out of the gate. Don't underprice yourself when you're first launching. And most of all, as you just said, have a financial foundation in place. Have a plan to cover expenses, both business and personal, for the first several years, because in the end, it just takes a couple of years.
And I think the crucial thing to note in that as well is it's mostly about having a business plan to cover your personal expenses. Like, it's actually not the business plan to cover the business expenses. Business expenses are not what bury you. Like, we're not running factories. We're not running restaurants where you have to take out 6-figure loans to buy all the equipment and the space and the lease and the rest. We still see a lot of members that are building firms, maybe at the low end at $10,000 of expenses. That's really bare bones. And, some members, I think, that have tried that have not been happy in finding out it takes a bit more than that. But even if you're looking at a firm that you spend $20,000 on between the technology, the website, is a little bit of marketing expenses, a little bit of compliance support, just the things that you need. For most who start firms, like, it's not the whatever it is, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 even of business expenses that makes it a problem to survive the first 2 or 3 years. It's your personal expenses. It's the mortgage and the family and the food and shelter and clothing and all those things that go along with your personal expenses side. It's still why we often see a lot of people launch firms from dual income households. Like, spouse number 1 has stable income while spouse number 2 launches their advisory firm, or building savings, or doing something not just to handle the business expenses, but to have a plan on how you handle the personal expenses, both A, so you can literally handle them, and B, frankly, for a lot of people, so that you have a plan to handle them that your spouse is on board with as well. Because one of the fastest ways to have your business not work out is not being able to provide for your family, and have your spouse say, so when are you going to stop this advisory firm thing and go earn some more money for the family because we're really financially stressed? Like, it's hard enough starting a business without having that layered on top of yourself. So if only for your spousal and marital sanity, at least if you're starting this as a couple, like, you need to have a plan for how your personal expenses get covered while you get through the first few years, because it's great every year thereafter. Like, it just keeps compounding. It just keeps growing. We'll talk a little later about what we see in revenue for firms that get further out into the kind of scaling and growth phase. But you don't get to win the long game if you get knocked out in the short game.
Absolutely. So one of the things you talked about earlier was niches matter. And obviously Michael and I have been big proponents of having a target market, having an ideal client profile, having a niche market ever since we started XY Planning Network and prior. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of language that we use here at XYPN, because that'll help. It'll be necessary as we start to explain this next chart and sort of the data that we see. But we break down sort of firms into 4 phases or 4 stages that they go through. Pretty much every business goes through. Stage 1 or phase 1 is preparing. This is when you're getting ready to launch your firm. You're getting your ADV in place, your client agreements, all of that. Then you ultimately launch, and then you go through the implementing phase. And the implementing is where you're ultimately implementing the business plan that you created in the preparing phase. Implementing goes from 0 up to 20 clients. At about 20 clients is when you flip into what we call the building phase. This is really when you start building the business. And so you go from 20 clients to 75. And then at 75 clients, you go into the scaling phase. Okay. And the scaling phase is ultimately when you've hit scale, you're starting to grow. And that's when sort of the firm can break apart into sort of 3 different types. We see enterprise firms who want to grow really, really big. They want to be hundreds of team members. You have boutique, which is smaller, maybe 5 to 10 people in the firm. You have a couple of advisors. You as the owner are doing financial planning as well as running a business. And then we have the solo practice. It's where you really want to stay solo. You don't want to hire any full-time team members. Maybe you outsource, some of your investments or your bookkeeping, or to an outsourced VA, but in the end, you're the only full-time team member. So again, we have preparing, which is getting started, implementing up to 20 clients, building up to 75 clients, and then scaling, which again splits into the solo, boutique, or enterprise. And so the next data set that we see is that niches do matter. They do ultimately provide long-term benefit, but there is a short-term cost to launching with a niche, which does make sense when you really think about it, and something that we've seen ultimately from many of our members who have said, well, I don't want to launch with a niche. I want to launch without one and then transition to having one later, because I think it'll be easier to get started without a niche. And they're not necessarily wrong in that assertion. I think we have recommendations for how to better implement it, though.
Yeah, I think the fear that a lot of firms have when getting launched and thinking about, am I going to have a niche? Am I going to focus somewhere? Really comes down to, when we're getting started from scratch, a lot of advisors have some level of natural market. So natural market's like the industry term for some people that are already in your life, in your ecosystem, to whom you could naturally market and to whom you already have a relationship, so you don't have to do the whole build relationships from scratch, which takes several years to be known, liked, and trusted. More commonly known as friends and family. I think that's basically what we're talking about, is friends and family. So when members launch entirely from scratch with no niche and no focus, we tend to just cast the wide net, which essentially starts out at friends and family referrals and trying to grow from there. And so the firms that start with friends and family referrals, one of the things we looked at is just how much new revenue did you get in the implementing phase? So that first phase, like you're going for your first 20 clients, how many clients and how much new revenue did you get? Firms that had no niche focus were averaging $23,000 last year. That's really a combination of firms that are in their first year and firms that are in their second year that are still trying to get to that 20 client threshold. So average of $23,000, almost $24,000 of new revenue. Firms that were new and started out in niches averaged $10,000. of new revenue in the implementing phase. So, if we go a little bit more focused, yes, we may end up excluding a little bit of those friends and family connections. And we do see that showing up in the data. But then when we go to the next stage, firms that are in the building stage, now you've gotten past 20 clients, you're trying to get to 50, you're trying to grow to the next level. So firms that have no niche went from growing $23,000 a year to growing about $31,000 of new revenue, right? You get a little bit larger, you got 20 clients, so there's a few that can actually finally give you some referrals. So growth starts to pick up a little bit. And we saw growth revenue as you move from implementing to building phase going from about 24 to about 31. If firms had a niche, though, as we said, they start off smaller, just over 10. But by the time they get to the building phase, they're growing at 33. So suddenly firms with niches start slingshotting forward. So yes, you were a little bit slower on growth in that first year or two in the implementing phase, but the growth pace starts to pick up to the point that even by building phase, firms with niches are growing revenue slightly faster than firms without niches, because we're at 33 for niche firms versus just 31 for non-niche firms, and picking up pace faster because non-niche firms went from 24 to 31 and niche firms went from 10 to 33. When we then look out to the next stage and we get to scaling, non-niche firms continue to pick up momentum. No great surprise, like you've got even more clients. By definition, if you're in the scaling phase, you're over 50 clients. And so as you get to the scaling phase, there's a lot of people giving you referrals, and we see revenue growth for firms in the scaling phase goes from 31 to 58,000. So the average firm that's at that stage is adding $58,000 a year of new revenue on top of the 150 or 180 or whatever it is that they're at that point. But niche firms, as they go from building phase to scaling phase, go from 33,000 of new revenue in building phase each year to $87,000 of new revenue in the scaling phase. So just to kind of sort of paint these in sequence, non-niche firms, in terms of the annual new revenue that they get, go from 24 to 31 to 58 as they get bigger and they have more clients to get referrals from. Niche firms go from 10 to 33 to 87. And so by the time we get out to the scaling phase, the average niche firm is growing almost $30,000 per year of new revenue faster than non-niche firms. And of course, that kind of just continues and compounds. If you're growing that much more every year, your numbers just get bigger with compounding over time. And so, cumulatively what we see, like the first year of niche, by the time you get to scaling phase, makes up more revenue than you ever gave up in the first year or two in implementing. Like that's why it matters so much. Basically, what we find is non-niche firms grow linearly, 24, 31, 58. And niche firms grow exponentially, 10, 33, 87.
And I know what people are thinking, which is, well, then why don't I just launch without a niche? I'll get some of that early business, and then I'll implement a niche when I'm in the building phase, when you sort of see this crossover, and then I'll take advantage of having a niche long-term. Because we just talked about the first couple of years are tough, and here we are saying, but we still encourage you to pick a niche and have an even worse first year. It's even harder than what we told you earlier. And the challenge is that you don't get the benefits in the building and scaling phase of having a niche if you don't have a niche in the implementing phase, because these things take time. You can't just throw it out there on your website, oh, now I have a niche, and suddenly you get all the benefits. These are relationships. These are your clients referring other clients. If you have a whole book of clients, whole base of clients that are referring clients that are kind of like them that aren't in your niche, you're not benefiting from the client referrals, the center of influence referral, from the marketing that takes, content marketing that takes years to ultimately build a following and build a presence. And so you can't cheat this system. If you ultimately launch without a niche, and then in the building phase, you sort of swap over to having one, well, then you've just set yourself back 2 years from the benefits of that niche. And so you're just going to have to wait 2 more years to ultimately benefit. Maybe you're making a little bit more money in the process, or maybe you're going to have to be the one who has that hard conversation with a client that says, we're no longer a right fit for you because you took on a lot of clients that no longer meet the sort of the target market that you want to work with. And so there is just no shortchanging this process. It just takes time.
Yeah. Well, and again, to emphasize even more, I mean, if you want to think about this over, say, the 10-year cycle of your firm, most firms spend a year or two in implementing, another 2 years in building, and usually somewhere out by years 4 to 5, we get to the scaling phase, and then we live there for years 5 through 10. So, like, just to put this in practical terms, like, you're talking about potentially making an investment in focus of $10,000 a year in the first 2 years of revenue you may not get because you're focused, so that you can get $30,000 a year every year for the last 5 years of additional growth, which is stacking up and annually recurring. Like, you're talking about giving up $10,000 or $20,000 at the beginning for $150,000 a year of annually recurring, growing, compounding revenue down the road. Like, this is frankly one of the best possible investment ROIs you ever get the chance to make, is turn 10 or 20 grand into $150,000 a year annually recurring in the long run, which is what it adds up to when you do this for years. But Alan, like, as you put it so well, like, the niche benefits aren't just because you're in the scaling phase. The niche benefits for firms in the scaling phase are because they spent the years making the growth investments to become known in their niche. So if you start out with a non-niche and you try to shift and pivot later, you're just still going to be not only are you going to be several years behind on this growth curve because you literally spent time not building your niche. What we see for most firms in practice, it's actually harder, because now you're specifically not known for the thing that you're suddenly trying to become known for. And the marketplace gets confused and people start asking, like, well, does that mean, like, you don't work with people like me anymore? And your revenue actually now goes backwards because the people that you tried to pick up early on realize that they're not a fit for where you're going. And so you can end up stalling the practice later. And we see a lot of firms that get stuck in the building phase. They're like 30 or 40 or trying to push to 50 clients, but it's getting harder. It's getting slower. They're really beginning to struggle with this because it's, there's all this work to get new clients and there's all this work to service the existing clients, and they don't feel like they're gaining momentum because they didn't have a focus. And that's a really busy time to start trying to figure out how to find your focus for the first time, because now you actually got a lot of people to service and a lot of stuff to do.
I do want to go back to, it's easy for you and I to sit here and say, oh, just make less money in your first 2 years because it has a 10-year ROI, trust us. And it does, but telling someone to make less money in their first 2 years is hard. And I get that from the listener's perspective. You're thinking, well, I need to make 20,000. I can't only make 10. And what you're hearing from us, and just want to say it more directly, is that it's worth waiting one more year to launch your firm. It's worth waiting a year, save up some money, build up that side stream of income, let your partner get a more stable revenue source, whatever that is. It's better to wait a year, even 2 years, and be ready and launch with a niche, make less money in year one and maybe year two, so that you're building a sustainable business that ultimately is providing what you want it to provide over the course of 10 years. Because yes, there are short-term considerations and long-term considerations, but don't launch your firm so early that you have to make, the long-term sacrifices that you're going to regret for short-term revenue.
I think that's such a good way to frame it, right? Like, what this really comes down to is, and I'll call it a investment readiness. If you are not ready to make a $10,000 income investment in your business for $150,000 a year of long-term recurring revenue, then you're not ready to make a $10,000 investment into starting your business. It's like, it's cool. Then figure out what you need to do to get to the foundation where you can build the business right instead of building the business desperately.
So I do want to touch on a third graph. I think we can do this one quickly because I want to be sure we get to all of these. But the third graph, and folks, you're just going to have to go to, again, xyplanningnetwork.com/286 to be able to see this, because it's going to be a lot of data here. But is showing ultimately just how growth compounds and how crappy those first couple years really are and how amazing those later years are when you're ultimately focused on building the business the right way.
Yeah, the chart and the chart here essentially shows 4 members that are in these different stages: implementing, building, and scaling. Like, how has their revenue grown and progressed over the past couple of years? Now, the folks that are in the implementing and building phase, the numbers kind of don't move up and bounce around a bit because if you do really well in the implementing phase, when you do next year's study, you're not in the implementing phase anymore because you actually grew out of it to the building phase. And if you do really, really well in the building phase, you're not in the building phase in the following year because you grew to the scaling phase because you got enough clients. So the real focus here is what happens in the scaling phase. Because once you're in the scaling phase, you're in the scaling phase. We have sort of different segments of whether you're trying to build sort of a solopreneur style practice as a solo, whether you're building a boutique or whether you're trying to build an enterprise. But once you're in the scaling phase, everyone's in the scaling phase. And so when we look at the scaling phase and how income levels have progressed in the scaling phase over the years of the network, what we see is over the past 4 years, back in 2016, the average member that was in the scaling phase was doing $139,000 of revenue. Number was even a little bit lower then because a lot of members were earlier in figuring out this model. And as we've said earlier, had a tendency to undercharge. By 2017, the average member in scaling was doing $171,000 of revenue. By 2018, the average member in scaling was doing $255,000 of revenue. By 2019, the average member in scaling was doing $319,000 of revenue. And so, again, not only do we see this sort of effect where like the first few years are sucky and then suddenly in year 4, you add more growth than the first 3 years combined, but it keeps going. After that, like it keeps compounding upwards, and 200 and 250,000 and 300 and 300 plus thousand of revenue. Ironically, I do think we may start seeing some of these revenue growth rates slow a little bit as members get higher from here, only because at some points, like we see a subset of members say, you know what, like my practice is doing 300 plus $1,000 of revenue and I'm taking home more than 70% of it after expenses. Like I'm cool. Like I'm netting 200. I don't need any more clients. I don't need to grow anymore because I'm like making all the money I wanted and achieving all the goals that I wanted. So, like these numbers get dragged down by the fact that a subset of our largest firms actually choose to stop growing because they got to their income goals. Not everyone, some wants to keep going and their businesses have other dreams and visions, but even slowed down by the fact that firms that hit their lifestyle goals sometimes stop growing because they hit their lifestyle goals. We see that this growth of $50, $60, $70, $80,000 a year of new revenue, it just keeps going because now you're even more known. You have even more clients to refer you. You're even more established in your niche. You're even more demonstrating your expertise. You're even more credible. You probably got more confidence in your pricing and are charging a little bit more for the full value of what you're offering. And all of that cumulatively is it just keeps getting better. And I know that's still not the best consolation when you're in year 1 and you're trying to be a record breaker who gets like $14,000 of new revenue and not 10. It's hard for everyone in the first year, but I think it's really important to note and highlight like how this compounds out over time if you can just stay focused and stay in the game. That's why we talk so much about having a good financial foundation for what you're building towards, because you don't get to do these numbers in the later years if you didn't have enough of a foundation in place to survive the first year or two.
You know, just taking this back to our personal story, people will ask, how did XY Planning Network grow so fast? You know, how ultimately, what has made it successful? And I do think it's worth noting that you nor I took a salary from XYPN for almost 2 years. I didn't for 2 years, and then you didn't for 4.5 years, I believe. I think going into year 5.5, I guess. You started taking a whopping $3,000 a month.
Yeah, I'm the lowest paid W-2 employee in the organization.
Yeah, and so people will ask about that, and that there are, in the end, we were fortunate that we had put ourselves in a position where we were able to afford to not take a salary for the first 2-3 years. Had we not, and we both needed to fund, our personal lifestyle and the business off of the business, we wouldn't have been able to reinvest in the business. We couldn't have hired the people that we hired to sort of sustain the growth and provide all the services and provide more benefits to our members so we could continue growing. So this is something we have lived as well, is that those first couple years are really tough, even if you're making a lot of money as a business, that in the end, if you're reinvesting for growth, it is a tough road, but it ultimately does have long-term benefits.
And the irony to that worth noting as well, that I think sometimes firms don't appreciate, or kind of advisors looking at going down this road don't appreciate, is the faster you want this growth to happen, the less you tend to make. And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes with some additional charts. But I hear a lot of like, well, I'd really like to make these curves go faster because I want to grow faster and make more money in my business faster. Like that's not actually how it works in practice. You can make these revenue numbers grow faster, but that involves putting dollars in. That means spending more on marketing. That means spending more on staff. That means hiring team members or outsourcing sooner and faster so that you can free up more time to market and do other things that bring in business. But it means you've got to reinvest more faster, which means your revenue might grow faster, but your profits actually probably grow slower and you get less money out and it takes longer to get there. And so I think that's the other thing that's important to note in this is not only is it hard drawing dollars out, but when you try to accelerate the process by investing more into it, like you can accelerate the revenue growth process, but that actually tends to make the profit growth slower, not faster. Again, there really aren't shortcuts to this. I mean, you can shortcut one thing, but it has trade-offs.
So one of the other things that we talk about is the scaling phase. And I know people hear me say scaling, but no, I'm a solo practice. I'm not scaling, right? That scaling is just for the enterprises. And we define that differently. We define scaling for a solo practice as scaling yourself, scaling your own time so that you can still serve more clients, spend less hours at the office, ultimately make more money, and have more time and freedom. And so one of the ways that we see people scaling, whether that be as a solo practice, as a boutique, or as an enterprise, is in what they outsource. Because in the end, the most valuable time that's being spent in the firm, the most expensive resource you have is your time as an advisor. And this year we asked sort of those who are, I guess actually this is in the implementing phase is what we're seeing. In those phases, what are people ultimately outsourcing? What are these firms outsourcing so that they can set themselves up for success long term? And not surprising, it's a lot of operational tasks, right? The two most outsourced components of the business were investment operations. 29% of firms in the is this right? In the implementing phase, were outsourcing investment operations. 24% were outsourcing bookkeeping and accounting because ultimately.
So when we talk about this phenomenon of like, if you do want to accelerate your growth path faster, like how do you make it grow faster? At the end of the day, the way you make it grow faster is you free up more of your time and resources to be able to do this. And so when we look at like, what are the members doing who do manage to grow faster in the implementing phase, who are making these reinvestments, like this is overwhelmingly the primary areas that we see them spending. 13% are spending on business development. So, they're spending money externally trying to market. But for so many of us, the primary way that we market and grow is ourselves, right? It's being out there, it's networking, it's building relationships, it's creating content in your niche, whatever it is that you do with your time to focus on growing the business. And so the big ROI on your time is often not paying for business development. It's paying for everything else so that you can focus your time on business development. And so basically what we see is the primary areas that get outsourced first and foremost for advisors who want to grow the fastest is outsourcing their investment operations. So, working with TAMP providers and investment outsourcers, and outsourcing their bookkeeping. Letting go of that business accounting. Like, it's not that we can't do it. In building my business, literally the first thing I outsourced was my bookkeeping. And it's not that I don't know how to do taxes and business accounting. Like, I nerd out about this stuff and I write 8,000 word articles on how to do tax planning for your business. But that's the point. Like, my business ROI was much better to spend time showing my expertise to grow the business about even something as straightforward as books and accounting than doing my own books and accounting.
Yeah, same here. My first, I bet I was making $10,000 a year when I hired my first bookkeeping, or I outsourced my bookkeeping, and I outsourced to my mother, Rhonda, who was getting her degree in accounting at the time and started doing bookkeeping for myself and some other financial planners. And now she's a full-time bookkeeper with the Bean team. FA Bean Counters, our in-house bookkeeping solution for advisors, both members and non-members. And so kind of funny how that ultimately worked out. But Yeah, I mean, at what point you're making $10,000 to $15,000 a year, we start to see folks signing up for bookkeeping services because it's usually once you're making $15,000, and then on December 31st you realize you haven't opened QuickBooks in 12 months. Is when we
and
get
you're going to have
hired.
to reconcile and clean up, and there's got to be tax reporting that you have to do because you're filing on your own Schedule C or a LLC or a partnership return or Yep.
FABC does a lot of cleanup work or going back and rebuilding books from previous years because advisors have just been focused on other areas. And so either you're spending time on bookkeeping and you shouldn't be, it's cheaper to outsource, or you're not spending time on bookkeeping and you need to outsource because you need someone to be sure your books and records are kept up to date, because we're actually starting to see more heavy hitting from the regulators around this, where they're looking for GAAP accounting balance sheets that are
which
properly,
basically means running accruals for your
a lot of states are now requiring accrual accounting, but they're looking for balance sheet. They're looking for income statements. They want to see that it matches up. They want to see that clients are being invoiced correctly, and so the regulatory burden actually in this area is increasing, which is probably also why we're starting to see more folks hiring a bookkeeper and outsourcing that early on.
Yeah, but I do feel the sort of inclined to point or acknowledge as well. Like obviously XYPN has some services around this, right? We have FAB encounters for providing bookkeeping services and XY investment solutions for TAMP providers. But like we're not talking about this because we have solutions for it. Like we built solutions for it because we're talking about this. Like the reason why we created these is because these are the pain points that members were regularly going through, that we could see in the data and that we could see in, or I guess just say hear from members when we went and said, like, what are your pain points and where are your challenges and what can we do to help solve that to make it easier for you to grow? And like, this was the answer. So this is what we went and put out and provided for.
Another interesting sort of data set that we asked about and gathered was how frequently advisors are meeting with their clients and what the average revenue is per client, right? How much money are you making per client and how often are you meeting with clients? And I do know that especially when we first started XYPN, we talked about charging a monthly fee. And what people heard was, well, if I'm charging a monthly fee, I need to be offering a monthly service. And that was a messaging mistake that we made that we've been working on correcting. That we say
I don't even feel like we messaged it. It was just sort of what got interpreted. Like, oh, if we're charging on a monthly basis, well, of course we're meeting with clients on a monthly basis. And we did then try to put out some guidance like, well, if you want to meet with people monthly, I guess here's what you can do.
Yeah, and that is a tough business to scale. And so the way we like to frame it now is it's an annual fee billed monthly. Okay, billed monthly or quarterly, but we see a lot of folks billing monthly. But in the end, you're charging a certain amount of money per year for the services you're providing. And so our next chart is sort of breaks down meeting frequency, revenue per client based on these three phases: implementing, building, and scaling. Again, implementing up to 25 clients and then 20 clients, and then building up to 75 clients. And interestingly, we do see there are still a handful, only about 10% of advisors in the implementing phase that are meeting with their client monthly, actually. By building phase, that goes completely away, which makes sense. You start out, you're like, I'm going to over-service these early clients. I'm going to be sure they don't leave. And by the time you're getting to 25, 30, 50 clients, you realize there's not enough hours in the day to meet with them every month unless you're charging a ton of money. And quite frankly, the people who are willing to pay a lot of money for financial planning aren't necessarily the ones who have time or interest in meeting with you monthly. And so we really see sort of a monthly meeting cadence go away. But we do start to see this shift of even quarterly start to get compressed, and more advisors are meeting with their sort of an even amount between semi-annually or even annually, which is really interesting. We think of financial planning as a quarterly service, and yet many advisors, as they're growing in their business, moving through the building phase into the scaling phase, are meeting with their clients less frequently.
And I think so first of all, the other thing that's so fascinating to note about this is the revenue that advisors are generating, or basically like what advisors are charging in fees. So as you noted, members that are in the implementing phase are much more likely to meet monthly and quarterly with their clients. And the average revenue that they generate is about $1,700. by the time we get to the scaling phase, no one is meeting monthly. Barely a quarter of advisors are meeting even quarterly. Almost everybody is either semi-annually or annually. That's like 70% of members are meeting semi-annually or annually, and they're charging $3,400 as an average fee for clients. Like, just be clear, like in the implementing phase, almost half of members are charging $600 for quarterly or more frequent. And in the later stages, members are charging double that, $3,400, to meet half as often. Just like basically the opposite of how it should work, right? Like normally you would expect, at least if you're meeting more frequently and getting higher touch service, you're paying more for it. And I think what we're seeing here instead really is that nervousness that I understand we all have when we're getting started and getting going. Like, I just want anybody to come on board and say yes and pay me. And we undercharge and overservice. And, we can get away with that to some extent because we don't have a lot of clients when we're getting started. So we'll take anyone and we'll service them a lot. But to me, what ends up happening here, and what we can see so clearly in data, is then when you get into it a while, you build more confidence in your value. You start charging what you're really worth. And you dial back the service because it gets comfortable. Like, oh, they really do pay me and I really am valuable. And I don't need to sell my soul in every single client that I work with to try to justify this fee that I'm charging. Like, I'm really worth it to meet, frankly, not only less often because I don't need to meet more often, but the truth at the end of the day is a lot of people are busy in their own lives. They don't actually want to meet with us every month. I mean, a few do, but because they got stuff going on. But most clients, they don't actually want to talk to us that often anyways. They can only handle so much financial things with everything else that's going on in their world. So this shift from mostly meeting quarterly or more frequently at $1,700 to mostly meeting once or twice a year at $3,400 is the shift that we see. And I think that's all about what happens when we really get confidence in our own value to charge what we're worth and provide appropriate service for what we're charging, but not over servicing relative to what we need to do for what we're charging.
Yeah, really interesting to see this breakdown of in the early phases, 10% are meeting monthly, 30% are meeting quarterly, and by the scaling phase, no one's meeting monthly and only 20% are meeting quarterly. So 40%, combined for monthly and quarterly meetings goes down to 20% monthly and quarterly. And you see that sort of get distributed throughout semi-annual, annual, or we even had some folks who say they meet with their clients biannually, which I do wonder if some folks read biannually as every 6 months or.
Yeah, I actually can't remember if we had specifically put in there like, but just to be clear, biannually is every other year, semi-annually is every half year.
So we'll have to check that for our next one, because I'm a little surprised that we have folks who, as many as 10% say they're meeting with their clients every 2 years. I seriously doubt that. The regulators would not be fond of that. So moving on to our next data set, one of the other interesting things that we see, and I have this conversation with advisors all the time. Back in pre-COVID days when we could go to conferences, people would say, well, what's the right fee structure? Should I be charging monthly? Should I be charging retainers? What's the right fee structure? And what I would say is that's the wrong question. The right question is, back to our earlier conversation, who's your ideal client profile? Who are you serving? And then once you're really clear on who you're serving, designing a fee structure for that client base or that ideal client profile is a lot easier. If you work with individuals, families, business owners, women, trusts, how do you structure a retainer fee? Is it $5,000 a year? Well, I don't know.
I'll know. Right? I'll just charge a percentage of their pot of money and go after the biggest pot I can.
Exactly, which is where I think that's one of the reasons AUM fees have sustained as long as they have and continue to do so. And that's because it does allow you to work with a very wide variety of clients and have a fee structure that's simple and easy to explain. It's 1% of AUM with a minimum of $1 million in assets. And so what we found, and not surprising, is that niche firms are commanding or are better at designing and commanding retainer fees versus AUM fees, or hourly, or really any of the other structures. But we're just seeing these niche focused firms able to structure their retainer fees in a way that makes sense, is profitable for them, is sellable to the client, and ultimately allows them to build a successful business.
Yeah, and just the most striking thing that we found in the data on revenue mixes, aside from just we have a lot of members that do a really wide range of models. So whatever you're imagining in your head is like the standard of XYPN, they all do blank. The answer is like whatever it is you're thinking, that's not the answer. The answer is members are really all over the place in what they're doing, because the clientele and the niche clientele that members are serving all over the place. And the ideal fee model is the ideal fee model for that client. So if you have a wide range of niches across XYPN, we end up with a wide range of fee models. The biggest takeaway to me around what we see on revenue mixes, though, is a very striking distinction that advisors with niches are drastically more likely to charge ongoing retainer fees. Advisors that don't have niches are much more likely to charge one-time upfront planning fees, but struggle more to charge ongoing retainer fees. Basically, they get the one-time revenue, but they struggle with getting the recurring revenue from retainer fees. So then they may end out with AUM fees or other models. But when you get more focused into a niche, in essence, one of the things that we see is it gets a lot easier to create a clear, distinct, valuable, chargeable, ongoing service when you're super clear about who it is that you're serving and what they want and need and care about. And so the more focused the firm, the more likely they are to be able to charge actual ongoing fees. When they're not focused, we tend to just see a lot of, I charge an upfront planning fee that may or may not fully compensate me for my time, and then I just get paid on assets under management.
Yeah, it's easier to sell that to a wide range of people, because the upfront fee, I'll just say it's $200 an hour, and this feels like a 20-hour plan or a 10-hour plan. It's a lot easier to do that when, that's really one of the only ways to charge, when you aren't clear on who you ultimately work with.
But the challenge then is it's hard to scale, right? We don't see a lot of firms that are very large in charging upfront or one-time fees, and in essence, because if you only get paid for your time, you can only scale you can only charge so much for your time. When you get a more focused clientele, you can build something that's really meaningful for them, which means in essence, you change from getting paid for your time to getting paid for your value. And when you're getting paid for your value, it's a lot easier to charge a viable, ongoing, retainer or recurring revenue fee for the ongoing value you provide to that particular client.
So moving into sort of our final data set that we wanted to talk about today, or sort of the final data points that we found interesting, was around profitability per client. And so there's sort of this mantra: in order to make more money, you need to grow really big, right? To make more money in the firm, you're going to need to just keep growing. And I'll say the second piece, which we can also address, is that the only way to build a firm that can be sold or has enterprise value for my loved ones, should I pass away or want to retire and sell the firm, the only way to do that is to build a boutique or enterprise firm. And so this year, I think this is the first year we've asked these questions, was around revenue per client, and then started breaking out some of the expenses, some of the direct expenses, some of the overhead, that ultimately got down to a profit per client figure. And really interestingly, if you look at revenue per client, a solo practice is making about $2,800 per client. Boutique is making $4,150, and enterprise practice is $5,000 per year per client. So revenue per client is higher as an enterprise or a boutique firm than a solo practice. But if you look at profit per client, the opposite is true. So the solo practice is only making $2,800 per client, but their net profit after expenses is $1,500, whereas the boutique is down to about $1,200, and the enterprise is $600 per client per year. And so we're actually seeing lower profit per client in larger firms. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I just want to really emphasize those numbers for how striking they are. And first, I just want to note again, we're only talking about members that are in scaling phase here. So they have already reached critical mass. Profitability gets kind of weird when you're like, well, I have 6 clients and I brought in $8,000 of revenue. What's my profit? So we're only talking about those who are in the scaling phase, who have already hit a critical mass of clients. I think this group was averaging north of 100 clients each. So just to give some context, we are talking about firms that have gotten to that level of establishment. And so within that group, then, we have this kind of breakout of firms that are solo practices and focused that way versus the firms that are building enterprises. And so I just want to repeat those numbers because they are so striking. So the average solo practice is working with, is generating $2,800 of revenue per client and is keeping $1,500 of it as a net profit. So roughly 60 cents on the dollar. And that's not uncommon. When you look at thriving solo practices, it's not uncommon to see owners taking home 60 cents on the dollar. Some really high profit solo practices take home as much as 70 or 80 cents on the dollar. But broad-based average we're seeing here was pretty close to 60 cents on the dollar. The enterprise firm, so bigger, more people, more stuff, more mass, more revenue, more affluent clients. We do see this trend that the larger the firm, the more it tends to attract more affluent clients. So the average revenue per client almost doubles from $2,800 to $5,000. But enterprises might be making $5,000 of profit, it might be generating $5,000 per revenue of revenue per client, but they're profiting $600 per client. So it's a profit margin. We're talking about 12%. So you go from a solo practice to an enterprise, and basically your profit margin is going from 60 to 12. So much so that even though the enterprise is working with clients with double the fees, they're still only making 1/3 the profit on double the fees. It is really hard and expensive to scale an enterprise. Now, I know at least some people are listening and like, yeah, but you have an enterprise at the end. Like you have a firm, you have a thing with like mass and economic value that you can sell. It's like, well, yeah, but if you're actually making only 1/3 of the profit over time, like you darn well better have a bigger firm that you can sell for more. You need that just to make up all the income you didn't make for the 3, 5, 10 years that you were trying to build this enterprise just to get it to the point where it would be valuable enough to make up all the income that you're not generating. And the truth is, high income solo practices are extremely saleable as well right now. Huge numbers of buyers for every seller. FP Transitions, I know, does a lot of tracking and documentation of this, and they routinely see purchase prices of 2 times revenue and as much as 3 times revenue for solo practices. Because as I'm sure a few people who are listening to this might think about, like, so let me get this straight. Somewhere out there, there's an advisor who generates like $250,000 a year of revenue and keeps more than 150 of it net. Like, forget all this, like it takes years to build crap. Like, I just want to buy me a practice with $250,000 of revenue that nets out 150 grand a year of profits. Like, basically, I'll buy a job that makes me $150,000 a year. And when you ask the question, like, well, how much would you pay for a job that makes you $150,000 a year? The answer is probably $500,000+. Like that's the going rate in the marketplace, because there are a lot of people who would happily take a loan to buy a job that makes them $150,000 net after expenses. So solo practices are very saleable as well. Granted, not as big as what you grow with the enterprise, but when your profit margins go from 12 to 60% or even up to 70 or 80%, you're suddenly in a realm where you may very literally net a lot more money by not trying to build huge and just trying to build focused. And I think the trap that a lot of people get into if they are solo practices and they're trying to figure out how to grow their income further is like, you don't add more clients and start scaling up the size, because as noted, you have to hire staff, hire team, and your overhead goes up and your direct expenses go up and your profits go down. It's get more affluent clients. Like if you want to know how the solo practices get from 60% margins to 80% margins, it's the ones whose average clients pay $5,000 as a solo instead of only, air quotes, only $2,800 as a solo. We had an advisor on the Advisor Success podcast a couple of years ago named Suneet Bala. And Suneet has a super focused lifestyle practice of this nature. And like, it's just an amazing practice. Like he has $300,000 of revenue, an 85% profit margin, right? You can do that math. 17 clients.
He's got, and works like 20 hours a week, if I remember right.
I mean, it doesn't take a ton of time to service 17 clients, even if you service the heck out of them. And like he is actually a pretty high touch, deep advisor, former engineer out of the technology world, works with engineers, which a lot of us know to kind of be a little bit more detailed, high maintenance clients, but 17 affluent clients and 300,000 of revenue, 85% profit margin. And even when you're high touch, does not take that much time to service 17 clients. And, Sunit's growth plans in a particular year is like, I'm thinking about taking a new client.
Yeah.
Like, I think I'm going
to lose one next year. So
I think I might add one because, I might lose one at some point. Like that's how he thinks about the practice. And it's not, scaling the heck out of it and hiring more advisors and recruiting and all this other stuff. Like it's just lifting your average revenue per client or, if you want to think of it simply, like if you're already in the scaling phase and feeling some of this pain and challenge, like it's not about getting more clients. It's about thinking about every time you add a client, you remove one. And you're only allowed to add clients above your average, and you're only allowed to remove clients below your average. And over time, your average revenue will lift, and your costs won't go up in any material way because it's still the same number of clients. And the biggest thing that drives costs in an advisory firm is the number of clients. And so this is why these are important numbers, looking at things like revenue per client as well as profit per client. But the key distinction here is, if you want the path to make more money, you do it by getting more fees per client by creating more value in the marketplace, not just by adding clients and growing bigger. If you just want to be big for the sake of being big, there are people like that. That's how they're wired. More power to them. Go build your enterprise huge. But the data is pretty clear. Like it's certainly not the easiest path to more income and financial success as an advisor. And it's not even clear that it even nets out more at the end of the day than simply being a focused solo practice that tries to work with more affluent clients while managing its cost structure.
And I hope what people hear, I talk to the team and advisors and members about this a lot, but one of the greatest myths of business is that there are right answers. Like there's a right answer of you should build an enterprise, you should build a boutique, you should be solo, you should make 100,000 a year, you should make 300,000 a year, you should work with a niche, you should not. None of those are right or wrong. They just are, and they're decisions that as an entrepreneur you have taken upon yourself. You've earned the right to make those decisions. And you should never, here I said should, don't should on yourself. You can take ownership of those decisions and build the business that works for you, for your family, for your life stage. The decisions that Sunit is making right now in his business when he has young kids in school and working 20 hours a week so he can be homeroom dad, which is the other half of his week, that may be different decisions than he would have made pre-kids or after the kids have left the home. And so just build the business the way that you want, the way that ultimately supports your lifestyle and your financial goals and life stage and all of those things. But don't listen to you have to grow big to do this thing. You have to stay small to do this thing. And this data really does show that the beauty of building a financial planning firm is that you can build it the way that makes sense for you.
And the other thing I think that is important to note in that discussion as well, like, you're allowed to change your mind.
Yes, you are.
Like, these are not, it's one of the cool things about being the business owner. Like, you own it. If you go down one of these paths and you decide at some point that you want to do it a different way, like, cool, go do it a different way. Like, hey, I was lifestyle for a long time, but now I've hit the stage where I want to grow big. Like, that's cool. Then make the change and start growing big. Like I've done that in my world, for a long time. The Kitces.com platform was just a smaller, narrower blog platform where I was the nerd writing my thoughts on the internet, and that was cool. Now I'm at a different age and stage and point in my career. Like, I want to make this thing a little bit bigger and grow it beyond me so that I can spend time across some of the other businesses and in other areas. So I'm changing what the platform looks like. And you get to do that as the business owner. So I spent 10 years very consciously running it as a lifestyle practice. And now I'm spending a couple of years very consciously trying to build it into a boutique. So you can make these shifts. These are not lifetime commitments that you make. Build the thing that makes sense for what you want to build, that accomplishes your goals. And, just kind of like the financial planning process itself, as your life changes and your goals change, you adapt your plan for wherever your goals are now.
So before we wrap up, I do want to address a question that we hear every year, and I just know if we don't address it on here, we're going to be talking about it in the VIP group or as part of one of our Ask Me Anythings at a conference. What about the firms that didn't make it? Okay, we have all this data of all these firms, but isn't this just survivorship bias, that only the firms that ultimately have survived are included in the data? So can you talk from your perspective how you think about that with just the number of firms who ultimately leave the network or ultimately fail for financial reasons in regards to the overall data set, and how that might impact if those firms' data were ultimately included in this?
Sure. So, absolutely fair to recognize. Now, we track this, we track just sort of what happens with members pretty rigorously within XYPN, because we want to know what's going on, make sure we're helping members as best we can, as many of them as we can. So kind of high level numbers overall, XYPN has something on the order of about 1% of members that leave in any particular month, roughly 12% a year annualized. Now, of those, they kind of fall into two broad groups. The first are members that just decide to move on because life and business changes. This is everything from I decided I don't want to be fee only anymore and I would like to sell life insurance. I'm merging with a broker dealer and now I'm not going to be fee only anymore. I've decided to sell my practice and merge into a much larger one, and I just want to live in tucked into a large firm. I don't actually want to be an independent anymore. We've had members like, I just found out I'm getting a divorce, and that means I can't really run my own solo firm anymore. So I need to make a change. All sorts of stuff that happens. Some of it's business changes, some of it's industry changes, some of it's life changes. That's about half of the members that we lose in any particular month. That just stuff happened. It had nothing to do with whether they were necessarily succeeding and failing in their business. Just external life happened. The other half, a problem cropped up. And they didn't succeed and survive. We find it's something right around 6% of members in any particular year that, in essence, that fail, that don't survive, and don't move on the network. And that's actually a number that's gone, as a percentage of the network, that's gone down for us a little bit over time, because what we find is, no great surprise, but almost everybody who doesn't succeed in the first year or two. Like, they didn't have enough runway. They didn't build enough lead time for themselves. They just, didn't reinvest in themselves to learn how to do business development and sell their value proposition and get clients on board. Like we do, we offer sales training, a lot of other things within XYPN, but some take to it a little bit better than others. So as the network grows larger and just more members have been in for a long time and are in the scaling phase, the percentage of members that are brand new and starting with us is smaller, just because the long-term membership grows as time passes. But we see this number somewhere on the order of 6% who join the network and don't succeed. Now, when we look at the implementing phase, their numbers are in there. So when we talk to you about these numbers like 10, 50, 80, 180 is the journey over the first 4 years, the implementing members that are struggling that first year are still in there because they're usually still in that struggling phase. What we see is there's a subset of about 6% of members who start out in the implementing phase and they never get to all the later phases and all the growth patterns that happen because they never get to 20 clients and they never get out of that first stage. So when we look at overall trajectory of what happens with members as they go through building phases, they go through scaling phase, and what all those metrics look like, they've been very stable from year to year with almost no survivorship bias that we're seeing in there. Because if you made it that far, the path tends to be pretty steady, and failure usually isn't really on the table at that point. You might leave the network because some big firm bought you and your life changed or you exited, but we don't see failures that would contribute to survivorship bias. So we do see this in the implementing phase, but the fact that virtually all failures happen in the implementing phase, on the one hand, means we're trying to focus on what else we can do to help members not fail there. But it means if you can survive through the implementing phase, we continue to see this very steady progression with the numbers that we've shared that have been consistent throughout the years. It is why we spend so much time talking about what are you doing to make sure you have enough of a foundation to get through the first few years. We see very, very few members, even amongst those who are struggling, who are like, I've been doing this for 2 years and I have 2 clients. I mean, just there's enough hours in 2 years. Like you end up finding some clients. It's usually, I've been doing this 2 years. I've got, 17 clients and I'm up to $30,000 of revenue, but it's not making enough for where my family needs to be and I need to throw in the towel. To which I would say like, well, okay, you're a little bit below the average because the average is $40,000 or $50,000 by the end of year 2. But some grow a little faster than others. But that's really a problem of you didn't have enough savings and foundation built up in the first place. And so I don't necessarily think of it as, I mean, yes, it is survivorship. There is a survivorship dynamic in who ultimately makes it to these numbers in the long run. But what we see is it's mostly a function of the people who don't do this. It's not because the path didn't work. It's because they didn't give themselves enough of a foundation to let the path work.
Yeah, and so important to recognize that, when someone leaves, as you mentioned earlier, sometimes it is because financially they're not succeeding, but sometimes it's also just they don't like running a business. And that entrepreneurship after 2, 3, 5 years, like, you know what, I'd rather just do planning, let someone else do this business stuff. This isn't fun. I'd rather just have a salary. And I don't want to do business development or whatever that is. And so, it is one of those things when we look at that, yes, that data could impact the overall data set, but in the end, it's a very small number of advisors that are ultimately not succeeding and closing up just for financial reasons versus the variety of other reasons that we see. And so to your point, the most important thing is have a financial foundation in place so that you have a plan that ultimately allows you to survive the first couple of years and understand those hiccups will come and be able to ultimately navigate them.
But again, when we talk about like what's happening with niche members who built into niches in the scaling phase and how they're growing, like those are members who had enough foundation to get through the early years. And so we see these numbers come through rather consistently. To the extent we worry about, survivorship bias, it's not what these income numbers were and what they added up to. It is just recognizing not everybody makes it through the first 2 years to get to these long-term numbers. And again, that's why we just keep talking about the importance of having enough of a foundation that you get to do the long term.
Well, Michael, thank you for taking the time to come on the show and help walk through the benchmarking survey. Again, for anyone who's interested in learning more, you can go view the graphs or the charts that we talked about on the website at XYPlanningnetwork.com and go check that out. Go check out the show notes and all the resources ultimately that we mentioned. So thank you, Michael, and thank you for all the listeners who joined us today. We'll see you next time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Avocado toast, selfies, a mountain of student loan debt. Gen Y is anything but traditional, and with over 75 million people, it's a population you don't want to ignore. Learn more about how to serve this unique population in our guide called Attract and Profitably Serve Millennial Clients in Your RIA. Discover 3 key ways to tap into the millennial market and 6 things that they want from their financial advisor. Visit xyplanningnetwork.com/millennials for your free copy. Be sure to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to hang out with other XYPN radio listeners, ask questions for future mailbag episodes, and finally, to find a community of like-minded financial advisors. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You are not alone and you are not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm, and that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.